My name is Eva Foster. I'm 34 years old, a financial compliance consultant based in Portland, Oregon. On paper, my life looks quiet and predictable. I work with contracts, risk assessments, and numbers that behave when you treat them with discipline. I'm the kind of woman people describe as steady, reasonable, not dramatic. If you met me at a family dinner, you would probably notice that I listen more than I speak. I don't interrupt. I don't raise my voice. I smile politely when someone makes a joke at my expense and choose not to correct them. Most people mistake that for softness. What they don't understand is that silence and weakness are not the same thing. For most of my adult life, I've been the dependable one, the daughter who didn't cause trouble, the wife who supported her husband's image, the sister-in-law who didn't compete for attention. I learned early that being agreeable made rooms easier to navigate. And when you grow up in a family where peace is valued above truth, you become very good at smoothing surfaces, even when something underneath is cracking. This story is not about explosive revenge. It's not about shouting matches or dramatic courtroom scenes. It's about something quieter, slower, more deliberate. It's about discovering that my brother-in-law was using my private photos to pressure my parents into transferring land that legally belonged to me. And it's about realizing that the man everyone called my perfect husband had installed hidden cameras in my bathroom and was calmly threatening to ruin my reputation if I didn't comply with what he wanted. I didn't find out everything at once. The truth revealed itself in layers, small inconsistencies, slight tonal shifts, subtle behaviors that didn't sit right. What hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that the people closest to me believed I would stay quiet. They believed I would protect the illusion of harmony over protecting myself. They believed I would choose shame over confrontation. They were wrong. This story will take you through how I was perceived, how I allowed certain things to normalize, and how something inside me shifted, not into anger, but into clarity. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I didn't destroy anyone. I simply stopped being invisible. And when you stop performing the role others assign to you, the entire structure around you begins to shake. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever stayed silent in a situation that felt wrong? Because you thought keeping the peace was the kinder choice. To my parents, I was the easy daughter. My older brother had always been louder, more ambitious, more visibly successful. He took risks. He negotiated aggressively. He married into money. When he spoke at family gatherings, people leaned in. When I spoke, conversations continued over me without anyone meaning to be rude. I was the stable one, the good one, the one who didn't need as much. When my grandparents left a small piece of land just outside the city in their will, technically in my name, my parents framed it as symbolic. "It's just paperwork," my mother said gently. "You're not even planning to build there." I nodded. I wasn't planning to build there. I wasn't planning to do anything. I simply understood that something had been entrusted to me. To my brother-in-law Daniel, I was useful. Daniel had a way of speaking that felt friendly, but measured. He called me smart girl sometimes, half teasing, half patronizing. He worked in real estate development, ambitious, polished, always calculating potential. He was particularly interested in that land, prime future expansion area, he once said casually over dinner, swirling wine in his glass. "You're sitting on something valuable, Eva. Would be smarter to consolidate it into the family portfolio." The family portfolio. It sounded generous, strategic, logical. It didn't sound like ownership being gently extracted. To my husband, Mark, I was the balanced half of our marriage. Mark was charming, organized, thoughtful in ways that impressed other people. He remembered birthdays. He sent flowers to my mother. He volunteered to host holidays. People called him perfect. They called us perfect. Behind closed doors, he liked structure, predictability. He liked knowing where I was, who I was with. He called it concern. "You're too trusting," he would say softly. "The world isn't kind to women who don't protect themselves." I used to find that comforting. Looking back, I understand something different. Protection can become surveillance when the protector believes he owns what he's guarding. But at that time, I was simply the calm one, the agreeable one, the woman who didn't escalate. At family events, I refilled glasses. I cleared plates. I asked about other people's projects. When Daniel steered conversations toward investment opportunities, I listened. When my parents suggested that consolidating assets would simplify things, I considered it. I didn't resist loudly. And because I didn't resist loudly, they assumed I wasn't resisting at all. There's a particular invisibility that happens when you are competent, but not combative. When you are steady, but not flashy. People assume your silence is consent. I wasn't unhappy. That's important. I was settled. I believed that love meant compromise, that family meant flexibility, that being mature meant absorbing small discomforts so others could feel secure. If someone had asked me, then whether I felt controlled, I would have said no. If someone had asked me whether I felt underestimated, I would have laughed. Underestimation doesn't feel sharp at first. It feels like being gently placed on a lower shelf, reachable, dependable, but never central. I didn't know yet that my quietness was being measured. I didn't know that my privacy was already being tested. And I certainly didn't know that the role they had assigned me, compliant, reasonable, low-risk Eva, was about to collide with something none of them expected, including me. The first time something felt wrong, it didn't look dramatic. It looked like a joke. We were at my parents' house for Sunday dinner. The air smelled like rosemary chicken and furniture polish. My mother had set out the good plates, the ones she only used when Daniel came over. My father was in a particularly cheerful mood, talking about property taxes and zoning changes as if they were fascinating dinner conversation. Daniel was leading most of it. He had maps open on his tablet, zooming in and out of areas around the outskirts of Portland. Development zones, future infrastructure plans, projected growth corridors. And then he zoomed in on my land. There, he said lightly. That parcel right there. It's basically sitting in the middle of the next expansion wave. He turned the tablet toward my parents, not toward me. My name was on the deed, but I wasn't the one being addressed. It would be a shame, he continued, if it just stayed idle because someone didn't want to deal with paperwork. Someone, my mother smiled at me gently. Sweetheart, Daniel's just saying you don't have to carry that burden alone. Burden. That was the first small cut. The land wasn't a burden. It required no taxes beyond what I already paid. It wasn't causing stress. I hadn't complained. But suddenly, the narrative shifted. I was the hesitant one, the overwhelmed one, the passive obstacle to progress. I laughed it off. I'm not overwhelmed, I said calmly. I just haven't decided what I want to do with it. Daniel's eyes flickered briefly, a micro-expression. Annoyance quickly masked. Of course, he said smoothly. Just thinking long-term. Families grow stronger when assets move strategically. Move strategically. The conversation flowed on. My father nodded thoughtfully. My mother poured more wine. No one challenged the framing. Later that night, Mark and I were driving home. The streetlights reflected softly on the windshield. You seemed tense, he said, glancing at me. I wasn't tense. You got defensive. I paused. I clarified. He exhaled softly, almost disappointed. Daniel's just trying to help your parents maximize value. You know he sees the bigger picture. There it was again. I wasn't seeing the bigger picture. I was the small picture thinker. The emotional one. The cautious daughter who didn't understand opportunity. I didn't argue. I simply watched how quickly the room had aligned around a story that positioned me as resistant. A week later, something else happened. Daniel sent me a message. Not about zoning. Not about paperwork. A photo. It was a picture of me at a family barbecue 2 months earlier. I was standing near the pool in a light summer dress. Candid. Harmless. But the angle was intimate. Closer than it should have been. Cropped tightly. Underneath, he wrote, "Careful what you leave floating around. People can misinterpret things." My stomach tightened. The photo wasn't scandalous, but it wasn't meant to be isolated like that either. I responded with something neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." He replied, "Just saying, reputation matters when property negotiations get complicated." Negotiations. The land had shifted from conversation to negotiation, and my image had been casually introduced into the equation. It was subtle enough to deny. If I confronted him, he could say I was overreacting. If I showed it to Mark, he would probably say Daniel was joking. But the message was clear. Your image can be used. Your compliance is expected, and your silence will be assumed. That was the first small cut. Not loud, not explosive, just a gentle demonstration that my privacy was not entirely mine. I didn't tell anyone, but I saved the message. And for the first time, I wrote something different in my black leather notebook. Test behavior. Document everything. The strange thing about subtle disrespect is that it rarely arrives alone. It repeats, softly. until you begin questioning your own reaction instead of the behavior itself. After that first message from Daniel, nothing overt happened for a while. No direct threats, no confrontations, just tone. He began including my parents in group messages about long-term asset alignment. He attached articles about market timing. He'd say things like, Eva's land could unlock real leverage for the whole family. Could unlock. As if I were hoarding something selfishly. When I didn't respond immediately, he would follow up with a light nudge. Just want to make sure this doesn't get forgotten. Forgotten. The implication was subtle but clear. I was negligent, slow, emotional. My parents started echoing him without realizing it. Have you thought more about consolidating? My father would ask casually. Daniel's just very forward-thinking, my mother would add. He sees potential. No one asked what I saw. At home, Mark's responses became calibrated. You know how your family is, he'd say, standing at the kitchen counter while I cooked. They operate as a unit. It's not personal. Not personal? It's fascinating how often that phrase is used to excuse personal boundary violations. Then came the second shift. One evening, I was getting ready for a work presentation. I had laid out documents across the dining table, compliance summaries, regulatory notes, printed contracts. I'm meticulous when I prepare. Mark walked by, glanced at the papers, and said casually, You know, if you put half this energy into the family property situation, it would already be resolved. I froze. Resolved how? I asked calmly. He shrugged. Signed over, structured properly. Integrated. Integrated. The word landed heavier than he intended. He wasn't asking what I wanted. He was assuming an outcome. And somehow, the fact that I was hesitating had become a flaw in my character. That night, when I went into the bathroom to shower, I noticed something unusual. A slight glint near the vent cover. It was small, easy to ignore. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. Because once you start noticing patterns, you have to decide whether you trust your instincts or the people telling you not to. I chose silence, not because I believed them, but because I wasn't ready to disrupt the illusion. That's how normalization works. You rationalize. Daniel's ambitious. He's just ping. Mark's protective. He just wants clarity. My parents are aging. They want simplicity. Each behavior on its own could be explained away. But the cumulative effect was this. My autonomy was being reframed as stubbornness. My privacy was being positioned as leverage, and my silence was being interpreted as weakness. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel said something that finally clicked. We were standing near the patio doors. He leaned closer than necessary and said quietly, You know, Ava, the easiest way to avoid unnecessary complications is to cooperate early. Cooperate, he smiled when he said it. There was no visible threat, no raised voice, just calm certainty. In that moment, I realized something critical. They weren't escalating because they didn't need to. They believed the pressure would eventually work. And what frightened me most wasn't Daniel. It was how natural this dynamic had become to everyone else, including me. That night, instead of dismissing the glint in the bathroom vent, I looked at it again. Longer. And for the first time, I didn't tell myself I was imagining things. I wrote another line in my notebook. If this continues, this was to... It is intentional. Because repetition removes coincidence. And I was done pretending coincidence explained everything. There's a moment when you stop reacting to individual incidents and start recognizing a pattern of expectation. That realization didn't come in a dramatic confrontation. It came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was folding laundry. I remember holding one of Mark's dress shirts, crisp, carefully ironed, and noticing how often I maintained the infrastructure of other people's lives. The meals, the reminders, the schedules, the emotional smoothing. I wasn't just the calm one, I was the stabilizer. In my family, I was the reasonable daughter. The one who wouldn't challenge my parents publicly. The one who wouldn't risk making holidays uncomfortable. To Daniel, I was the technicality. The name on a deed that could eventually be persuaded into alignment. To Mark, I was the emotionally intelligent partner who would understand why big-picture decisions sometimes required compromise. No one had explicitly said, "Yo, your job is to comply." But the expectation hovered, reliable, useful, invisible. I began replaying conversations differently. When Daniel spoke about family unity, he looked at my father. When my mother reassured me that this is for everyone's benefit, she avoided direct eye contact. When Mark said, "You don't want to create friction," his tone carried something else, something closer to warning than advice. I realized something uncomfortable. My role wasn't accidental. It had been assigned gradually, because I rarely objected, because I valued peace, because I understood legal structures but didn't weaponize that knowledge socially. In their eyes, I was safe. Safe to pressure, safe to overlook, safe to assume. That week, the land came up again, this time more formally. Daniel had drafted what he called a preliminary integration proposal. He sent it in a neatly formatted PDF: charts, forecast models, projected appreciation curves. My name appeared twice, both times in small font. Owner of record, not a decision maker. At dinner, he explained the model with confidence. If we restructure now, we avoid capital gains complications later, he said. Eva won't have to manage any of it. We'll handle everything. We handle everything. My father nodded. That does simplify things. Simplify for whom? I asked one question, calmly. What legal protections would I retain if the land is transferred into the development trust? The room shifted slightly. Daniel blinked once. Protection! Yes, I said gently. Reversion clauses, asset distribution contingencies, control thresholds. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't accusing anyone. I was simply demonstrating that I understood the mechanics. And in that moment, something flickered across Daniel's face. Not anger, recalibration. He hadn't expected resistance framed in competence. Mark squeezed my knee under the table, a subtle signal. Don't push. That small gesture told me more than any words could have. My assigned role did not include scrutiny. Later that night, Mark stood in the bathroom doorway while I removed my earrings. You blindsided him, he said quietly. I asked a legal question. You know how he operates? He builds momentum. You slowed it. Slowed it. As if the pace of asset transfer was more important than my consent. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. For years, I had believed that being agreeable made me strong, that flexibility was maturity, that endurance was a virtue. But endurance without boundaries is simply accommodation. And accommodation, repeated long enough, becomes expectation. They weren't villains. They were operating within the role I had allowed them to believe. And I was operating within a role that kept everyone comfortable. Except me. That night, instead of brushing off the unease, I acknowledged it clearly. If I continued playing the reliable, reasonable, non-confrontational Eva, the outcome was already decided. The land would move. My objections would be reframed. And my silence would be interpreted as agreement. The realization wasn't loud. It was colder than that. I wasn't being asked what I wanted. I was being managed toward compliance. And for the first time, I wondered, what would happen if I stopped cooperating with the role entirely? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen when Daniel sent another strategically worded message. It didn't even happen when Mark told me, again, that I was overcomplicating a simple decision. It happened on a quiet Thursday morning. I had woken up earlier than usual. The house was still. Mark had already left for the gym, or at least, that's what he had told me the night before. The light filtering through the blinds was soft and pale. I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I noticed it again. The glint near the vent. This time I didn't dismiss it. I stepped onto the closed toilet lid, leaned closer, and stared directly at the small metallic reflection tucked behind the grill. It wasn't dust. It wasn't a loose screw. It was deliberate. My heart didn't race the way I expected it to. There was no dramatic surge of panic. Instead, there was something else, a very quiet, very steady clarity. I climbed down slowly, walked to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time, I allowed the two threads of my life to connect. Daniel's message about my reputation, the subtle pressure around the land, Mark's increasing emphasis on cooperation, the careful monitoring of my tone, the way he sometimes asked, casually, "What time will you be home?" and followed it with, "Just checking." The way he once commented on a conversation I had with a colleague that I never told him about. And when I asked how he knew, he said I must have mentioned it. Had I? I sat there for a long time, replaying details not as isolated events but as data points. I work in compliance. My brain understands patterns. When separate irregularities begin aligning, you don't dismiss them. You audit. I didn't confront him. I didn't touch the vent. I didn't call the police, my parents, or Daniel. Instead, I opened my black leather notebook, and I wrote 3 sentences. Possible surveillance. Reputation leverage established. Asset pressure coordinated. I wasn't certain yet, but I was no longer uncertain enough to ignore it. Something inside me shifted in that moment. Not into fear, into ownership. For years, I had thought strength meant absorbing discomfort gracefully. That morning, I understood something different. Strength is recognizing when you are being strategically positioned and choosing not to move where you are being guided. I showered as usual. I dressed for work. I kissed Mark goodbye when he returned, sweat still on his forehead from the gym. He smiled at me the way he always did, warm-composed, almost proud. Almost. Big day? He asked. Just meetings, I said calmly. He studied my face for a second longer than necessary. I smiled back. There was no confrontation in my voice, no accusation in my eyes. But something had changed. I wasn't waiting to be reassured anymore. I wasn't trying to interpret their behavior in the most generous possible light. I was observing. That evening, Daniel sent another message in the family group chat. Need clarity on timeline. Investors are asking. Investors. There had never been any formal agreement involving investors. The escalation was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, I didn't feel pressured. I felt informed. Because pressure only works when you believe you have no alternatives. And that morning, standing on the toilet lid, staring at that glint behind the vent, I realized something profound. They thought I was the least dangerous person in the room. They believed my silence meant surrender. They assumed my calm meant compliance. They had mistaken my restraint for limitation. And that misunderstanding would become my advantage. I closed my notebook that night with a steadier hand than ever before. The shift wasn't explosive. It was internal. I stopped asking, how do I keep this peaceful? And started asking, how do I keep this mine? After that morning, my silence changed. Before, it had been automatic, a reflex shaped by years of wanting harmony. Now, it has become intentional. There's a difference. When Daniel brought up the land again, I didn't deflect. I didn't argue either. I simply said, I'm reviewing options, and left it there. No emotional tone, no defensiveness, no elaboration. Ambiguity unsettles people who rely on momentum. He responded with a thumbs-up emoji, but he stopped adding detailed projections for a while. At home, I behaved exactly as I always had. I cooked dinner. I asked Mark about his day. I maintained routines. What changed was internal calibration. I began noticing how often he sought information under the guise of care. Are you still meeting Claire after work? Did you reschedule that legal consult? Did your parents say anything new about the land? The questions weren't aggressive. They were frequent. I answered selectively, factually, minimally. Yes, not yet. No. The less I elaborated, the more he filled in silence himself. You know, I just don't want you blindsided, he said one evening, leaning against the kitchen counter. Daniel moves fast. I'm aware, I replied calmly. He watched me carefully. For years, my silence had been open-ended, an invitation for others to define the narrative. Now, my silence was closed. Strategic. I purchased a small handheld RF detector online. Nothing dramatic, just a consumer-level device. I had it delivered to my office instead of the house. Not because I was certain, but because certainty is not required for precaution. The package sat unopened in my desk drawer for 2 days. I didn't rush. I didn't spiral. I scheduled my reactions the way I schedule audits, methodically. Meanwhile, the land pressure evolved. Daniel requested a formal discussion. He framed it as respect, transparency, alignment. My parents seemed relieved. It's better to clear the air, my mother said. Clear the air, as if I were the one clouding it. At the meeting, Daniel presented revised documents, cleaner, more structured. He had added clauses that appeared protective, but only at the surface level. He spoke confidently. Mark nodded at the right moments. My father looked tired. And I realized something crucial. They interpreted my quiet composure as softening. They believed I was gradually yielding. The irony was almost elegant. Silence, when misread, becomes camouflage. That night, back home, I used the RF detector in the bathroom. I didn't panic when it beeped faintly near the vent. I didn't cry. I didn't confront. I simply documented. Photo, timestamp, device reading. Then I tested other areas. Bedroom smoke detector, bedroom alarm clock, living room bookshelf. The pattern became undeniable, not widespread, selective, intimate spaces. The implication wasn't about general security. It was about control. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the detector loosely in my hand, and felt something settle inside me. Fear had passed. What remained was clarity. If Mark had installed surveillance, and the data confirmed it, then this was no longer about family pressure alone. It was coordinated leverage. Reputation, privacy, asset transfer, compliance. Daniel's message about misinterpretation made more sense now. Images don't have to be explicit to be damaging when framed correctly. And suddenly the structure was visible. Pressure the asset. Undermine autonomy. Control information. Frame resistance as instability. The precision of it almost impressed me. Almost. The next morning I made breakfast as usual. Mark kissed my cheek. "You've been very calm lately," he said softly. "I appreciate that." I smiled. "I've been thinking," I replied. He seemed satisfied with that. He had no idea that my calm was no longer about compromise. It was about positioning. Silence is powerful when chosen, because when people assume you're passive, they stop guarding themselves. And when they stop guarding themselves, they reveal far more than they intended. I no longer needed to guess. I needed to prepare. Preparation does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like someone is continuing to show up to work on time. Someone replying to emails. Someone attending family dinners and asking polite questions. That was my advantage. They thought nothing had changed, but internally everything had. The first thing I did was consult a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone within Daniel's professional circle. I chose a specialist in digital privacy and marital asset protection. I scheduled the meeting under the pretext of estate planning consultation. When I sat across from her, calm, organized, with printed timestamps and RF readings, I did not dramatize anything. "I have reason to believe surveillance devices may have been installed in my home without my consent," I said evenly. "And there is concurrent financial pressure related to inherited property." She didn't react emotionally. She leaned forward. "Do you have documentation?" I slid the folder across the table. "This is what they nut me." It's about me. I don't react impulsively. I build cases. The lawyer explained my options carefully. In our state, non-consensual surveillance in private spaces carries severe legal consequences. Distribution threats, even implied ones, are prosecutable. She advised me not to remove the devices yet. "Preserve the environment," she said. "Let professionals document it." So I did. I scheduled a licensed digital forensic technician. Again, during hours Mark believed I was at work. The devices were confirmed. 2 in the bathroom vent, 1 in the bedroom smoke detector, none in shared living spaces. That detail mattered. This wasn't about home security. It was about control in moments of vulnerability. Meanwhile, I requested certified copies of the land deed and historical transfer records, quietly, online, through official channels. I also placed a notice of ownership verification and temporary transaction freeze, a protective mechanism allowed under state property law when ownership is under potential coercion review. Daniel would not be able to move anything without triggering alerts, but I didn't inform him. Preparation is most effective when invisible. At work, I adjusted my digital hygiene. New passwords, 2-factor authentication, device scans, separate cloud storage. I also revisited Daniel's message, the one about my reputation. I had saved metadata, timestamps, original file properties. It had not originated from a family group share. It had been taken on a device positioned at an angle inconsistent with typical candid photos. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, not to accuse, to archive. At family dinners, I behaved as usual. When Daniel referenced investors growing impatient, I asked neutral clarifying questions. Which registered entity are they operating under? What's the projected capital stack structure? He answered vaguely, because there were no investors. There was only urgency, manufactured to accelerate compliance. Mark began watching me more closely. "You seem distant," he said one night. "I'm focused," I replied. That was true. Focus is quieter than anger. He mistook my steadiness for emotional withdrawal. He didn't recognize it as strategic distancing. I also opened a separate bank account in my name only. Not because I intended to flee, but because independence requires liquidity. Then I did something even more important. I stopped reacting internally. When Daniel texted, I did not feel the old tension. When Mark asked where I had been, I did not feel defensive. I felt observant. They were still operating under the assumption that pressure plus time equals surrender. What they never noticed was that time was no longer working in their favor. Every day, they believed I was softening. I was strengthening documentation. Every dinner they thought reinforced family unity, and I was mapping behavioral patterns. Every calm response they interpreted as compliance was actually calibration. There's a misconception about quiet people, that we endure because we cannot act. In reality, we often endure because we are deciding how. By the end of that month, I had legal counsel retained, surveillance professionally documented, property transaction safeguards activated, digital evidence archived, financial autonomy secured, and not one person suspected anything had shifted. Daniel still spoke confidently. Mark still smiled warmly in public. My parents still believed this was about simplifying assets. But I understood now. This was about leverage, and leverage only works when the other person fears exposure. I did not fear exposure anymore, because the truth, when documented properly, protects more than silence ever could. And I was almost ready. The moment of private revelation didn't feel triumphant. It felt clinical. The digital forensic report arrived in a sealed envelope. I opened it at my office, not at home. The findings were precise, time-stamped, unemotional, exactly the way I needed them to be. 3 micro cameras, installed approximately 4 months earlier. 4 months? That timeline mattered. 4 months ago was when Daniel first began escalating discussions about consolidation. 4 months ago was when Mark started asking more detailed questions about my schedule. 4 months ago was when that first subtly threatening photo appeared. Coordination doesn't require a written agreement. It requires aligned interests. The devices had remote access capability, encrypted transmission, cloud storage routing, professional installation, not impulsive, planned. My lawyer didn't speculate. She simply outlined the implications. If you choose to proceed legally, she said, this carries criminal liability. Civil damages are also substantial. Choose to proceed. That phrase lingered. I didn't feel rage. I felt confirmation. The uncertainty that had once gnawed at me. The small internal voice asking, "What if you're exaggerating?" disappeared entirely. I wasn't paranoid. I was correct. But the deeper revelation came when the forensic technician quietly mentioned something else. There were access logs, he said, multiple remote logins from 2 IP sources. 2, one traced back to our home network. The other is a commercial office building registered under Daniel's development firm. He didn't elaborate beyond what was documented. He didn't need to. The alignment was complete. Reputation leverage, asset pressure, surveillance. The structure wasn't chaotic. It was strategic. That realization did something unexpected. It removed the emotional fog. When betrayal is ambiguous, it hurts more. When it's clear, it becomes solvable. I sat alone in my car afterward, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and I asked myself one question. What outcome do I actually want? Not revenge, not humiliation, not destruction. I wanted autonomy. I wanted the land secured. I wanted my privacy protected. And I wanted the narrative, the quiet assumption that I would comply, permanently dismantled. Those goals required precision, not explosion. That evening at dinner, Daniel spoke enthusiastically about a narrow closing window. Mark nodded in support. I listened, calm, composed, because now I understood something they did not. The leverage had shifted. If they attempted to escalate publicly, they would implicate themselves. If they tried to intimidate me privately, I had documented evidence. If they attempted to manipulate my parents, I had legal safeguards in place. I didn't need to threaten exposure. The possibility of exposure. And they didn't even know it yet. Later that night, Mark stood in the bathroom brushing his teeth. I watched him in the mirror, the same mirror beneath which a device had once been hidden. "You've been very thoughtful lately," he said, mouth half full of toothpaste. "I think you're coming around." "Coming around?" I held his gaze calmly. "I've reached clarity," I said. He smiled slightly, interpreting it as agreement. It wasn't an agreement. It was resolved. That was the private reveal, not the confirmation of surveillance, not the IP logs, not even the coordination. It was the realization that I no longer needed them to understand my boundaries. I simply needed to enforce them. And enforcement, when quiet and lawful, is far more destabilizing than anger. They still believed I was the least dangerous person in the room. They had no idea I now held the most decisive information, and I was about to choose how to use it. When you hold decisive information, the question is no longer what happened. The question becomes, what do you do with it? I had options. Option 1, confront Mark privately, demand explanations, watch him attempt to rationalize, possibly negotiate quietly in exchange for silence. Option 2, go directly to law enforcement, allow the criminal process to unfold, accept that the fallout would be public, messy, and irreversible. Option 3, confront Daniel first, force him to acknowledge coordination, see whether pressure collapses the structure from the outside in. Option 4, do nothing immediately, continue building leverage, Choose timing strategically. For the first time in my life, I didn't choose the option that minimized discomfort. I chose the option that eliminated control. Before acting, I requested one more thing from my lawyer, a formal cease and desist draft prepared but not yet delivered. It outlined documented evidence of unlawful surveillance, referenced applicable statutes, and included a notice of intent to pursue both civil and criminal remedies if coercion related to inherited property continued. It did not accuse publicly. It did not threaten theatrically. It stated facts. Then I scheduled a private meeting with my parents. Not at their house, not with Daniel present, a neutral coffee shop on a weekday afternoon. They seemed slightly confused but agreed. When we sat down, I didn't start with emotion. I placed a single document folder on the table. I need you to listen carefully, I said calmly. And I need you not to interrupt until I finish. My father frowned slightly. My mother looked concerned. I am not transferring the land, I continued. Not now, not later. And any further pressure related to it will trigger legal action. My mother blinked. Legal action? Against who? I slid one page forward. It was a summary, not graphic, not detailed, stating that unlawful surveillance had been documented in my home and that attempts to leverage reputation in connection with property negotiations constituted coercion. I did not name Daniel. I did not name Mark. I let the implication sit. My father's face changed first. Not anger, recognition. He had worked in municipal administration long enough to understand what certain phrases meant. This is serious, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. My mother's voice trembled slightly. Are you safe? Yes. That answer mattered more than anything else. I am handling this legally, I continued. But I need you to understand something clearly. This was never about simplifying assets. It was about control. Silence stretched across the table. They had underestimated me too, but not maliciously. They had assumed I would bend because I always had. I won't discuss details right now, I added, but I will not tolerate further pressure. I stood to leave. My father reached for my hand briefly. We didn't know. I know, I sobbed. And I meant it. The decision I had made was simple. I would not negotiate with manipulation. I would not argue emotionally. I would not explode. I would formalize. That evening, I informed my lawyer to proceed with formal notification, delivered simultaneously to Mark and Daniel's registered business address. No warning text, no dramatic confrontation, just documentation. Irreversible. Because once a legal notice is served, dynamics shift permanently. The illusion of quiet compliance dissolves, and there is no way to return to casual Sunday dinners as if nothing happened. Driving home that night, I didn't feel powerful. I felt steady. Some doors close loudly, others close with a soft click that changes the pressure in the entire room. This was the soft click, and they were about to feel it. The notices were delivered on a Tuesday morning at 9:14 a.m. I know the exact time because my lawyer forwarded confirmation receipts. One signed at Mark's office, one at Daniel's development firm. I was sitting in a client meeting when my phone vibrated twice in quick succession. I didn't check it. That was deliberate. Power shifts are most effective when you don't rush to witness the reaction. By the time I returned to my desk, there were 3 missed calls from Mark, 2 from Daniel. No messages. Silence from them felt different now. Tighter. Controlled. I sent one text to Mark. In meetings most of the day. We'll talk tonight. Neutral? Unemotional. At 1:07 p.m., Daniel finally sent a message. This is unnecessary escalation. No greeting. No explanation. Just framing. I didn't respond. Because this was no longer a conversation. It was a legal process. The cease and desist had been carefully structured. It did not demand a public apology. It did not threaten media exposure. It did not contain inflammatory language. It stated 3 things clearly. Unlawful surveillance devices were documented in private areas of my residence. Digital access logs connected to specific IP sources had been preserved. Any attempt to coerce property transfer under threat, explicit or implied, would result in formal civil and criminal proceedings. There was also a deadline, 10 business days to respond through counsel. Not through family, not through me, through attorneys. That shift alone dismantled the informal pressure system they had built. At home that evening, Mark was waiting in the kitchen. The air felt different, less relaxed, more calculated. What is this? He asked, holding the document. His voice wasn't angry. It was careful. It's a formal notice, I replied calmly. placing my bag down. You involved lawyers? Yes. His jaw tightened slightly. You could have talked to me. I am talking to you, I said evenly, through appropriate channels. He stared at me as if recalibrating an equation that no longer balanced. Daniel called him while we were standing there. I could see the name flashing on the screen. Mark declined the call. That detail mattered, because for the first time, Daniel wasn't dictating pace. Mark lowered his voice. Do you understand what this could do? Yes, I replied. And you're willing to go that far? I'm willing to go exactly as far as necessary. There was no shouting, no tears, no dramatic accusations, just measured the distance. The cameras had already been professionally removed under supervision earlier that day, preserving chain of custody documentation. The property freeze had triggered internal review alerts. Daniel's ability to manipulate timing was gone, and Mark's ability to privately negotiate without a record was gone. They had assumed silence meant vulnerability. They hadn't accounted for silence evolving into structure. Later that night, Mark slept on the couch. Not because I demanded it, because something unspoken had shifted between us. Control thrives in ambiguity. I had removed ambiguity. The next morning, my parents called. My father's voice was heavy. Daniel is furious, he said. I expected that, I replied calmly. He says this will damage everyone. Only if everyone continues the behavior, I said. There was a long pause. Then my father said something I hadn't anticipated. You're handling this like an attorney. No, I corrected gently. I'm handling it like someone who owns what's hers. That was the difference. Ownership. Of land. Of privacy. Of narrative. Of consequence. Nothing explosive had happened yet. No arrests. No court dates. Just paperwork. Deadlines. Documentation. And the quiet understanding that the ground beneath them was no longer stable, because when you move in silence long enough, by the time others notice, the structure has already changed. Consequences rarely arrive as dramatic explosions. They arrive as disruptions. Daniel was the first to feel it. 3 days after the notices were delivered, my father called again. His tone wasn't defensive this time. It was unsettled. 2 of Daniel's partners have paused a pending deal, he said quietly. Something about internal compliance concerns. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. When a registered business receives formal notice involving digital misconduct and coercion allegations, even if not yet public, it triggers internal risk reviews. Investors become cautious. Legal departments start asking questions. Momentum slows. And Daniel operated on momentum. He called me once that week. I let it go to voicemail. His message was controlled but strained. We need to resolve this privately. There's no reason to drag external parties into a family misunderstanding. Family misunderstanding. The phrasing almost sounded rehearsed. I forwarded the voicemail to my lawyer without replying. Meanwhile, Mark's consequences were quieter. He began sleeping less. I could hear him pacing at night. His phone lit up more frequently, short, tense conversations in the hallway. At breakfast, he attempted to be calm. You're overcorrecting, he said one morning, stirring his coffee without drinking it. You've turned a solvable issue into something adversarial. I didn't install cameras, I replied softly. The statement hung in the air between us. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. That silence told me more than words would have. For years, I had protected his image instinctively. I smoothed his sharper tendencies. I translated his intensity into ambition for others. Now I wasn't translating anything, and without my interpretations softening the edges, his behavior looked different, more exposed. My parents began shifting too. My mother stopped mentioning the land entirely. My father asked one careful question during a phone call. If this proceeds legally, will it become public? It depends on their response, I said honestly. Another pause. Then he said quietly, I didn't realize how much pressure you were under. Neither had I, not fully until I stepped out. The subtle but profound consequence wasn't just legal. It was relational. For the first time, Daniel was not the strategic leader in the room. He was defensive. For the first time, Mark wasn't guiding conversations about big-picture thinking. He was reacting. Control had shifted, and with that shift came discomfort. Daniel's development firm issued an internal memo about data security audits. I only knew because a colleague casually mentioned hearing industry chatter. Nothing public, just whispers. Whispers are often the earliest form of consequence. Mark asked me one evening, is there anything you want from me? It was the first vulnerable question he'd asked. Yes, I said. What? Truth. He looked at me for a long moment. I was trying to protect us, he said finally. That word again. Protect. I didn't argue. Because this wasn't about semantics anymore. It was about accountability. Consequences are uncomfortable, not because they're unfair, but because they remove denial. Daniel could no longer pretend this was a casual asset conversation. Mark could no longer pretend surveillance was a concern. My parents could no longer pretend this was about simplification. And I could no longer pretend I didn't see the structure clearly. Nothing irreversible had happened yet, but the emotional architecture of our relationships had shifted permanently. Respect, once assumed, was now being renegotiated. And the renegotiation was not happening on their terms. It was happening to me. Not through anger, through boundaries. And boundaries, when enforced calmly, are far more destabilizing than confrontation, because they leave no room for reinterpretation. Panic doesn't always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks like politeness intensified. Daniel requested a clarifying meeting through his attorney on the 9th business day, just before the response deadline. The tone was measured, cooperative, emphasizing miscommunication. Miscommunication! That word does a lot of work when people want to minimize intention. My lawyer advised me not to attend in person. Instead, we held a formal video conference. Recorded, documented. Daniel appeared composed but thinner somehow. The easy confidence had tightened into calculation. There was never any intent to coerce, he said carefully. We were exploring strategic options as a family. And the surveillance devices? My lawyer asked evenly. Daniel glanced slightly off camera before responding. I have no knowledge of any devices. It wasn't an outburst. It wasn't denial with emotion. It was a distance. But distance doesn't erase metadata. My lawyer didn't argue. She simply stated, access logs tied to your firm's IP infrastructure have been preserved. Silence followed. Not dramatic silence, heavy silence. The kind where legal exposure becomes real. After the call, Daniel sent my parents a long message about how things had spiraled unnecessarily. My mother forwarded it to me with a single line. I'm starting to understand. That acknowledgement meant more than any apology would have. At home, Mark's composure began cracking in subtle ways. He started explaining things without being asked. I only accessed it a few times. I never shared anything. I was making sure you were safe. Safe from what? He never answered that. One night, he stood in the doorway of the bedroom. The same doorway where months earlier he'd gently squeezed my knee under the dinner table to signal me not to push. You could have destroyed me, he said quietly. I still could, I replied. There was no threat in my voice. Just a fact. That was when the reality settled over him. I wasn't escalating publicly because I didn't need to. The evidence existed. The option existed. And that option would always exist. Trust once fractured this way doesn't mend through explanation. It fractures through exposure of intent. Daniel's firm quietly suspended one internal manager pending review. It was a protective maneuver, an attempt to create a buffer layer of blame if needed. Too late, because the access trail had already been preserved independently. My father called again. I told Daniel to step back from all discussions regarding the land, he said. Indefinitely. Indefinitely. The pressure pipeline had collapsed. Not because I shouted, not because I begged, because I formalized. Mark asked me one final time, is there any way to make this go away? And that question revealed everything. He still believed this was about damage control. It wasn't. It was about consequence. You can't undo documentation, I said calmly. You can only respond to it. He sat down slowly, as if absorbing a weight that had finally become tangible. The cameras were gone. The property was secured. The legal notices were active. But what could not be reversed was this. They now knew I would not protect them at my own expense. And once that knowledge exists, dynamics never return to their previous shape. Too late to smooth it over. Too late to reframe it as a misunderstanding. Too late to quietly nudge me back into compliance. The role they had assigned me no longer fit. And there was no way to tailor it again. Not after clarity. The final confrontation wasn't scheduled. It happened organically, but not accidentally. Mark asked if we could talk properly. Not in passing, not in fragments between meals. A real conversation. We sat at the dining table on a Sunday afternoon. The same table where he once told me I was slowing momentum. The same space where I used to fold laundry and believe stability was love. There was no raised voice, no trembling hands. Just two people sitting across from each other with the illusion removed. I need to understand, he began carefully. When did you stop trusting me? I considered the question honestly. When I realized you were gathering information, instead of offering protection, I said. He flinched slightly at the phrasing. I was afraid, he admitted. Daniel can be aggressive. I thought if I had leverage, I could manage the situation. Leverage. That word again. You installed cameras in private spaces, I said evenly. That's not management, that's control. He looked down at the table. I never intended to use anything against you. But you created the option. Silence. That was the core of it. He hadn't needed to threaten me directly. The existence of the material was enough. The possibility of exposure shifts power automatically. And Daniel? I asked. He hesitated. I told him I had access, he said finally. I thought it would make him back off if things escalated. I held his gaze. Instead, it aligned you. He didn't argue, because he couldn't. There was no explosion in the room, no dramatic accusations, just the slow recognition of cause and effect. You could file criminal charges, he said quietly. Yes. Are you going to? I haven't decided. That was true, not because I was unsure of my strength, but because I was clear about my intention. Punishment wasn't my goal. Prevention was. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. What do you want now? He asked. The question felt different this time. Less defensive, more resigned. I want autonomy without surveillance, I said. Ownership without negotiation, and a life where I don't have to audit my own marriage. His shoulders lowered slightly. I don't know if I can undo what I did, he admitted. You can't, I replied gently. You can only accept what follows. The confrontation ended without shouting, without slamming doors, without tears, because emotional heat would have diluted clarity. Later that week, Daniel requested one final mediated call. He spoke carefully, choosing every word. I regret how this has unfolded, he said. I misjudged the situation. Misjudged, not misunderstood. Misjudged. He had calculated incorrectly. He had assessed me as pliable, and the assessment failed. The land is yours, he added. We won't pursue it further. Won't pursue, as if it had been a campaign. I didn't respond with anger. Noted, I said calmly. No sarcasm, no triumph, because this wasn't about winning. It was about equilibrium. When the call ended, I felt something surprising. Not relief, not satisfaction, just stillness. Confrontation without heat forces everyone to face reality without distraction. There were no villains in a dramatic sense, just choices. Choices made under the assumption that I would remain small. I didn't need to grow louder. I just needed to stop shrinking. And once I did, the entire structure adjusted around him, quietly, irreversibly. There's a version of this story where I become hardened, suspicious of everyone, closed, bitter. That isn't what happened. What changed wasn't my softness. It was my threshold. Mark and I are no longer living in the same house. The separation was formalized with a legal structure. Clear terms, clear boundaries, no dramatic scenes, no public spectacle. Just documentation. He tried, in his way, to explain himself until the end, to frame it as fear, as poor judgment, as a misguided attempt to protect what he valued. Maybe part of that was true, but protection without consent is possession, and possession is not love. Daniel's firm continues operating, though more cautiously. My father stepped back from informal advisory involvement. My mother stopped trying to smooth conversations that were never hers to manage. The land remains mine, not because I fought loudly, but because I refused to relinquish it quietly. The deeper shift, though, happened inside me. For years, I believed maturity meant absorbing discomfort gracefully. I believed intelligence meant seeing everyone's perspective. I believed kindness meant minimizing your own needs so others wouldn't feel challenged. I still value empathy. I still believe in understanding context. But I no longer confuse empathy with self-erasure. I learned something fundamental. When people assign you a role that benefits them, they will defend that role as if it's your identity. The reliable one, the calm one, the easy one, the reasonable one. I am still calm, but I am no longer easy. There's a difference. I still speak softly, but when I say no, it is final. I still listen, but I do not internalize narratives that shrink me. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer perform invisibility to make other people comfortable. Silence is still part of who I am, but now it is chosen, not imposed. When I walk into a room, I don't need to dominate it. I don't need to correct every misunderstanding. I simply know where I stand. And that internal certainty changes how others interact with you more than any confrontation ever could. I keep the black leather notebook, not because I'm afraid, but because documentation is clarity. Clarity is protection, and protection no longer requires secrecy. Sometimes people ask, gently, carefully, whether I regret escalating legally. I don't see it as an escalation. I see it as alignment. Actions met with appropriate consequences. Boundaries enforced at the correct scale. There was no revenge, no humiliation, no destruction, just recalibration. Who I am now is not someone louder, not someone colder, just someone who understands that peace without autonomy is not peace. And I will never again confuse the two. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic ending. An arrest, a public apology, a courtroom victory. There wasn't one. What happened instead was quieter, and in many ways, more permanent. The pressure stopped. The negotiations stopped. The subtle framing of me as overthinking stopped. Not because I convinced anyone emotionally, but because I changed the structure they were operating inside. When someone believes you will tolerate gradual boundary erosion, they don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as practical, strategic, even helpful. That's what makes quiet manipulation so dangerous. It hides behind reasonable language, family unity, protection, simplifying things, big picture thinking. And if you're someone who values harmony, you will often cooperate, not because you're weak, but because you're kind. But kindness without boundaries invites control. The most important thing I learned wasn't how to fight. It was how to formalize. When you document instead of argue, when you consult instead of react, when you enforce instead of threaten, you don't need volume. You need clarity. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I didn't destroy reputations. I didn't expose private details publicly. I simply made it clear that I would not sacrifice myself to preserve an illusion. And once that becomes visible, dynamics shift permanently. If you're in a situation right now where something feels subtly wrong, not dramatic, not explosive, just slightly misaligned, I want you to remember this. Repetition removes coincidence. Patterns reveal intention. And silence can be strength, but only when it's chosen. So let me ask you something. Have you ever mistaken your own endurance for maturity, only to realize later that what you really needed was a boundary?